और बैकग्राउंड नॉइस आ रहा है हमारी तरफ से?
Sir, we
Any
are live.
any background noise from my side?
No, sir, please begin.
Okay, that's fine. So audience, namaskar, good morning. We are back again, and today I will tell you that sky is brighter. We have great scholars from across the world. We have Honorable Professor Dr. Vikram Mishra ji. He has specialization in virology and molecular biology. He did his postdoctoral from the University of British Columbia and McGill Universities. He is currently with University of Saskatchewan, and where he is heading a lab which has a specific focus on the bad zoonosis there. Dr. Mishra is also known, and we have great regard for him because he is producing great scientists as his students. So today, Dr. Mishra will let us know about the immunity of the super immunity of the bats and how this knowledge can help us, the humanity, in protecting itself from the pandemic COVID-19, which is again spread by the SARS-CoV-2, the same coronavirus. We have Professor Dr. Nirmal Gupta ji. The exclusive thing about him that he has conducted over 17,000 open heart surgeries in India. He is professor and head of the cardiovascular surgery department and thoracic surgery, sorry, at the SGPGI Lucknow. He is he has been a Marian Ivanescu Fellow in the Pediatric Surgery Leeds. He has also worked as a cardiac surgeon at St. Anthony Hospital, London, and after working there for 8 years, he decided to come back to India. Here in India, he joined AIMS and then moved to SGPCI Lucknow, and since then he is there giving his services to people of Uttar Pradesh and India. So this is about Professor Dr. Nirmal Gupta ji. He is just not a surgeon, he is a scholar of modern medicine. So I would request him to share his knowledge with us. And then we have Professor Dr. Gyaneshwar Chaudhary from BHU. He heads the cytogenetics lab over there in the Department of Geology. He has served in Estonian Biocenter, Tartu University for 8 years, and then he also decided to come back to India when our Honorable Prime Minister made an impression, global impression that India is rising and we are going to become the Vishwaguru in coming decade. So Dr. Gyaneshwar Chaudhary has taken a call, the nationalist call, and decided to come back to India. So we have three stalwarts, three three experts to educate us about the pandemic, which is caused by the virus SARS-CoV-2. From the foundation, I wish to let you know that we are focused on bridging the scholars, the scientists, and the society. Because unless the society is educated and the awareness is spread, the science itself can't do. For the overall upliftment of the society, it is required scientists and scholars to work, and their work should reach out to the people. At Indology Foundation, we try our best to make it happen. On the pandemic, we have a small research team, and on the pandemic, we have been doing the meta research on the researches at our end since the April 2020. We published many papers in the Hindi, which appeared in the tutorials of Hindi newspapers, and one or two in the English newspapers. And our researchers, I tell you that the world was different, even WHO was different in 2002 when this pandemic came first. It was epidemic those days. So in 2002 and 2003, Under the impression, the pressure of WHO, two ministers, Chinese health minister had to resign for mishandling the SARS-CoV epidemic situation. Also, Taiwan's health minister had to resign from his position for mishandling uh, SARS-CoV-2. SARS-CoV. So that was a different world. Chinese premier said that it is China's responsibility to control the epidemic and help saving the world before the pandemic it takes the shape of pandemic and spreads out to the other countries. This time we see a different world, different WHO. No resignations happened. Rather, a different stand has been taken. Though it is almost nearly the same virus with known uh, known familiarity with the earlier one. Still, it was called a novel virus. Of course, it has some difference, some variations, but it is a next version of the same virus. The same measures has been announced to save life, like wearing mask, maintaining social distancing. All was done in 2002 and 2003. Uh, the earlier virus also spread from the bat. So this is what we have found. Earlier also, great amount of effort was put in for developing the vaccinations, but I do not know why the vaccinations were, development of the vaccinations were left in between. No vaccine reached to the third stage of clinical trial. Some efforts were done to develop the antiviral drugs, but all the efforts were left in the between. This time we see some efforts are reaching towards their conclusion. So I have honor to have this session and invite Professor Dr. Vikram Mishra to take it forward. Thank you, sir.
Lalitji, thank you so much for your invitation to participate in this discussion. As I understand it, I'm to give you a slightly different perspective on the COVID-19 causing virus and tell you a bit about how bats might be involved and how bats are absolutely amazing animals. And they've learned how to, through evolving for millions of years, they've learned how to deal with their viruses. And perhaps we have something to learn from them. So if you'd allow me, I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to share. Can you see that?
Yes, sir, we can.
Okay. So as Lilithji said, in bat zoonotic diseases or diseases that people can get from bats. This hasn't always been so. My interest in bats is relatively recent, the last 15 years or so. And it began in a very strange way. If you work at a university in North America, you are extremely privileged because every seventh year they allow you to take a year off and go somewhere and do something interesting that you can bring back to your own university. And for a variety of reasons, I wanted to spend the year in a laboratory in Manitoba, the province next to Saskatchewan. This laboratory is called the National Microbiology Laboratory, and it's a fairly unique place. It is the Canadian equivalent of the Centers of Disease Control in the United States. It is the only place in Canada where you can work with some really dangerous and nasty viruses. And if you're a virologist like me, spending a year in a place where you can work with nasty diseases is indeed a privilege. So I wanted to be there. The other very unique thing about this is the only laboratory in the world, really, of this type, which combines human diseases and animal diseases. And my interest has always been in zoonotic diseases. So it was great to sort of go there. This map shows you where this is. This is a map of Canada. Saskatchewan is over here. Manitoba is over here. And British Columbia, where I am these days, is over here at the end of this little island that you see on this place. So Of course, the problem was that at that time I wasn't working with anything that the NML or the National Microbiology Laboratory would be interested in. I wasn't working with anything particularly dangerous. However, I did some research and wrote the director of the laboratory an email with this information, and that is that in the last 20 or 30 years, some very dangerous viruses have spilled over from bats into other animals. And just sort of give you an idea. So these bats belong to 4 different groups. The rabies viruses, as far as we know, all rabies viruses originally or originated in bats, and over thousands and thousands of years have established themselves in other species. But we still have bat rabies. In fact, in North America, where we have very few cases of rabies, almost all the cases that have appeared in the last 20 or 30 years have been accidental transmission of bat rabies to people. Now, as far as the Nipah virus, which people in India are very familiar with because it's been causing outbreaks in Bangladesh and northern India for some time. And then a few years ago, there was an outbreak in southern India as well. And Hendra virus in Australia. These 2 viruses, the evidence for the link to bats is very real. You can find these viruses in bats, and you can see their transmission from bats into horses and animals in Australia almost every year, and from bats directly into people in Bangladesh and in India. So here the evidence is really clear. The evidence is also very clear for the Marburg virus, which is very much like the Ebola virus. And you see outbreaks of Marburg hemorrhagic fever in Africa on a fairly regular basis. The evidence for the coronaviruses, and these include the SARS virus, the original SARS virus that Lalit was talking about, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, or the MERS virus, which causes outbreaks in the Middle East almost every year. A couple of, let me just get my marker over here. Might be better. There. And of course, the COVID-19 causing virus. For all of these and a couple of animal viruses as well, the big viruses, for all of these viruses, the evidence is largely circumstantial, and it's based on detecting viruses, coronaviruses that resemble these viruses in bats. So their evidence is circumstantial. We're not absolutely certain about it, but the evidence is very good. So originally, all of these viruses probably came from bats. Ebola is very much the same thing. There is circumstantial evidence for Ebola being a bat virus, but we don't know for sure. So what I did was I sent the director a letter, an email saying, well, if all of these viruses have spilled over, we have lots of bats in Canada, and yet no one has ever looked to see what our bats actually have. And I have a year. If you want, I can take on this project. And within about 15 minutes, I got a reply back from him saying that, this is something we've been really thinking of doing. If you come over, we'll support you financially and with the laboratory. So everything was fine. So I packed up my bags and ended up in Winnipeg. Winnipeg, as it turns out to be, Manitoba, is a really interesting place and a really great place to work with bats, because here's a map of Manitoba. Here's Winnipeg over here. And these yellow areas over here are limestone. And wherever you've got limestone, you have caves. And we have really long and harsh winters. And so the caves are unique in that it could be minus 45 outside the caves, but inside the caves, especially the deep caves, the temperature is, whether summer or winter, is always about 5 to 6 degrees Celsius, which is ideal temperature for animals to hibernate in. So in southern Manitoba, interestingly enough, the limestone caves are used by snakes to hibernate, and so you have well, let's not go there. There are a lot of snakes in these caves. In northern Manitoba, these caves are used by bats for hibernation. And so here's a cave. Here's what the cave looks like from the surface. We go in there, and then we can collect bats or study bats, or bring them up to the surface and then examine them. So it's a great place to look for bats. And I spent a year doing that and looking for bats all over Western Canada. And we found lots of viruses, discovered lots of new viruses. So let me tell you a bit about here. Let's get back to the slide for a second. And that is that while all of these diseases, all of these viruses cause really serious and often fatal diseases in people, they don't do anything to bats at all. Bats carry these viruses, Nipah and Hendra, and viruses that look like all of these coronaviruses. They carry them for long periods of time. They don't eliminate the viruses, and the viruses don't cause them any harm at all. It's a very benign, friendly relationship. And we don't really understand why that is, and that's one of the focuses of my work. The other thing we don't know is why do these viruses spill over occasionally from bats to other species? So before I do that, let me tell you a bit about bats because I find them absolutely fascinating. So the bats belong to a mammalian order called Chiroptera, and that comes from the two Greek words, chir, or hand, and pteron, and wing, or hand wing. And you can see why that is, because here you've got a bat from Africa, and you can see that very clearly that the bones that form fingers in our hand form the wings of this bat. And bats are the only mammalian species, only mammals that have evolved the ability to fly. Okay? There are other mammals that can sort of glide, but bats are the only mammals that can fly. And this may have something to do with how they interact with their viruses, because what happens is that when bats are not flying, their metabolic metabolisms and their heart rate is very low. However, when they fly and they have to use up a tremendous amount of energy to fly, and when that happens, their metabolism goes up, their heart rate goes up, and when that happens, they generate toxic molecules called oxygen-free radicals. And so if there was no way of dealing with these oxygen-free radicals, it wouldn't be great. And so over the years, they've evolved ways to deal with oxygen-free radicals and the negative effects of elevated metabolism. And this may have something to do with viruses, and I'll come to that in a minute. The other thing about flying is that they can cover long distances. They can cover thousands of miles. There's some migratory bats that spend the winter in southern United States and Mexico and South America. And in the summer, they migrate all the way up to Canada, thousands of kilometers to spend the summer. And then they go migrate back. So they can migrate long distances. And what that means, though, is that if they have viruses that they can transmit, or they may have the possibility of transmission, they can transmit these viruses over long distances. They're incredibly diverse. So 1/5 of all mammalian species are bats. Think about it. 1/5 of all mammalian species are bats. There are about 1,500 species of bats. They're that diverse. Here you have one example, and this is similar to the chmagaddars you have in India, a fruit bat. The Indian fruit bat has a wingspan of about 2 meters. They're huge. And on the other hand, you have and they're fruit-eating bats. Here you have an insect-eating bat called a thigh bumblebee bat, and it's small enough to fit on the thumb of your hand. And in Canada, we have these tiny bats as well. So there's a huge variation. They occupy just about every part of the globe other than the Antarctic and the northern reaches of the Arctic. So they're everywhere. There are species that are adapted to eating fruit. There are species that are adapted to eating insects. There are species that are adapted to surviving on blood meals, the vampire bats in Central and South America. There are predatory bats that eat other animals as well. So they're incredibly diverse that way. Now, one of the things about their diversity is that we often think of bats as one thing, one unifying group, and they're not. Each species is different. So when we find something about one species of bats, it may or may not apply to all species. I want you to keep that in mind, because what I tell you about one species may not be true for everything else. However, there are certain things that they do have in common. They live an incredibly long time. Okay, now here's a bat picture that a friend of mine took, or one of my colleagues took, in a cave in Manitoba. And this little fellow over here, you can see that he has two wing bands. There's a blue one and there's a silver one. The blue one was put on this bat, and we used to do this to identify bats that we captured and then released. This blue band was placed on him in 1980. The silver band was placed on him in 2008, and this picture was taken in 2010. So this bat is over 30 years old. All right. Now that might not seem a lot. I mean, humans live a long time, so 30 years isn't very much, but this is pretty incredible because there seems to be a relationship between the size of body mass, how big you are, and how long you can expect to live. There's a linear relationship. The bigger you are, generally, the longer you can expect to live as a species, not necessarily as an individual. However, there are exceptions. Humans actually live longer than we would expect to live, given this relationship. There are some species, though, that are very, very small and would normally not be expected to live very long. Most of these species, 14 of the 15 species that lie in this area over here, are bats. So bats can live an incredibly long time. And some of the reasons why they can live so long in such a healthy way, it probably relates to their ability to deal with viral infections. They've been around for a very, very long time. This is a fossil of a bat. It very clearly looks like a bat that might exist today, and it's from about 50 million years ago. If you do some molecular paleontology, in other words, you look at the DNA from bats that exist today, here are the species of bats that exist today, and you calculate how long it takes for genetic change to occur. And then if you start working backwards, what you find is that all of these species diverged between 35 and 55 million years ago. And that what simply means is that it is possible that if you were around 35 to 55 million years ago and you saw bats flying around, you might recognize some of the bats that you see today. So they've been around for a very long time. And what this means as far as their relationship to viruses is concerned is that they have had a very, very long time to adapt to their parasites, such as viruses. And their viruses have had a very, very long time to reach a relationship with them, which is extremely balanced. So why don't viruses make bats sick? Well, this is $1 million question, and a disclaimer, I don't really think we know. We have some clues, and we're working towards finding that out. In fact, there are several laboratories in the world that are looking into this because it's a fascinating question. So what I want to tell you is why we think viruses don't make bats sick. So let's just first see what happens when we get a viral infection. So when we get a viral infection, the first thing that kicks in is what we call the innate response. This is the innate immune response. We call it the innate response because it is inherent in our ability to deal with infections, viral infections. And it kicks in almost immediately, about within a day of the virus establishing itself. And two things happen. We respond by two different mechanisms. First of all, we produce molecules called interferons. And they're called interferons because they interfere with viral infection. So they suppress viral infection. But at the same time, what happens is that we trigger inflammation. Now, when what inflammation does is that it brings cells that are responsible for controlling viral infection to the site of infection, and they do a number of other things. They produce molecules called cytokines that set up a chain reaction of things. Now, when these two things are balanced, when interferons are balanced with inflammation, everything is fine. Recovery happens fairly rapidly. The adaptive immune response, like antibodies and cell-mediated immunity, kicks in, and everything is well and good. However, if this thing is unbalanced, if you have too much inflammation, then things go wrong. In fact, for a lot of viral diseases, for a lot of serious viral diseases where we see huge morbidity and huge mortality, most of the reasons is not what the virus is doing to your cells. It is what the body is trying to do in response to viral infection. And this is true for severe cases of influenza It leads to all sorts of things, fluid in your lungs, your inability to breathe. It is probably, although we're just started finding out, one of the reasons for the serious what happens in more serious cases of inflammation. Your body's overly responding or responding in an uncontrolled and unbalanced way to infection. So this is what happens when we or other animals get infected. What happens when bats get infected? Well, I had a grad student. Well, by the way, he got his master's degree from the National Institute of Virology in Pune. We've had a very strong and active relationship with the NIV. So he did his master's. In fact, he did his master's project while he was doing his master's at the NIV in my lab, and then came back to do his PhD. He's now a very successful scientist in his own right. So what he did was he said, well, what's the difference between humans and bats? Let's look at it from a very, very simple way. Let's take human cells and let's take bat cells and let's infect them with a coronavirus called the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. This is a virus which could be the next pandemic. It causes outbreaks in the Middle East almost every year. That's the epicenter. It goes from camels to people, and there's fairly strong evidence that it originally came from bats, and then bats to camels and to people. So what he did was he infected human cells that are in blue and bat cells with this virus. And first of all, he looked at how much virus these cells produced. And as far as human cells are concerned, they produced an enormous amount of virus, but then they died. So all the human cells died if they were infected with the MERS virus. Bat cells, on the other hand, produced some virus, a lot less virus, and then the level of virus went down, but the cells survived. They continue to live. If you look at the interferons, if you look at the antiviral response in these cells, what you found was that in bat cells had a very strong response to viral infection. So within 48 hours, you found a massive interferon response. Human cells, nothing, absolutely nothing. And this is because the virus has mechanisms to turn off the antiviral response in these cells. If you look at this molecule called TNF, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule that triggers inflammation, it was just quite the opposite. In human cells, you saw a massive response. They produced lots of this molecule, and presumably, if this was in an animal or a human being, it would trigger a strong inflammation. Bat cells, absolutely nothing at all. He explored this further, and he found that bats have a very active mechanism for actually turning off the inflammatory response. It's not just that they don't respond; they turn it off. And this was very unique. If you want more details about this, we've published this article a few years ago. So and now other laboratories have found that the other bat species have different mechanisms, but they all work the same way. Bats have an enhanced antiviral response, and they have a suppressed inflammatory response. So we think one of the reasons bats don't get sick and we do is because we can't control inflammation. The other thing they found, and again, another student from the NIV, who's a physician, he did an MBBS in India, came and worked in my lab, and now is at the Harvard Medical School as a postdoctoral fellow. And what they found, and my lab assistant Noreen and Gerald Falzerano, who is a senior scientist at the Vaccine and Infectious Disease Organization, they found that if you infected bat cells, they didn't die. And in fact, you could keep these cells going for a long, long time. And these figures just tell you that each and every cell in this culture is infected. They're healthy cells. They keep producing virus and they don't die. Anyway, so what is our hypothesis? What is my lab actually trying to do? Well, what we're trying to do is our working hypothesis is that the relationship between bats and their viruses is a balanced one. And it is balanced because of environmental factors, viral factors, and host factors. Bats have certain properties. Their viruses have evolved to not cause any harm, and the environment probably plays a role as well. However, if you disrupt this relationship, if you disrupt this viral relationship, then what happens is that viruses start to multiply in large numbers, and that's when the chances of spillover to other species goes up. And how do you want to do this? Well, what we've done is we've got two bat species that are around in North America, the little brown bat and the big brown bat. The little brown bat is actually quite tiny, and the big brown bat is not much bigger than that, but because one's bigger than the other, we call it a big brown bat and a little brown bat. And this tells you in North America their range. So we've got these two bats. And the reason why we're looking at these bats and their viruses is, as I told you, there are 1,500 species, and each of those species has evolved along with its own viruses in a very unique way. And so you can't really take one bat species and take a virus, someone isolated in China, and try to get some real answers about what's going on. So what we want to do is we want to look at our local bats and their own viruses. We've isolated a few viruses from our bats. Here's one, a gamma herpes virus that Sony and Noreen were responsible for. This just tells you that it's a very, very complex virus. It has over 100 different genes, and over 70% of our brown bats have this virus. Again, the bats don't get sick. Our pathologists, our wildlife pathologists tell us they can see absolutely no pathology as a result of infection. However, it's there. And the virus is fairly closely related to two human viruses, the Epstein-Barr virus and the Kaposi sarcoma causing herpes virus. The other virus is a coronavirus, which we discovered while I was in Winnipeg, and we've worked with it since then quite extensively. It's a coronavirus, and this just tells you that it is distantly related to the SARS virus and the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome virus, but it's related to some other coronaviruses that cause common cold-like infections in humans. And then what we do is, this is our model. We have these two viruses. We have their bats and their viruses. And what we can do is we can observe what happens in nature, their relationship, and then we can use this to form hypotheses about what might be happening between viruses and bats. And then because we have a cell culture model in the laboratory, we can sort of explore these hypotheses and test these hypotheses in a cell culture model and do lots of molecular biology to figure out what the molecular relationship is and what triggers a change in things. And finally, again, to summarize what we've found over, and not just us, but other laboratories as well have found about the relationships bats have with viruses and their unique immune systems is, first of all, they control excessive inflammation. The what really causes the symptoms often of when you get a viral infection. So they actively suppress pro-inflammatory genes. They reduce response to DNA damage that might be caused by toxic molecules as a result of flight. But some of those responses are related to how they respond to virus as well. And there's a negative selection for inflammation-related genes as well. At the same time, they have a heightened antiviral response. They have viral genes that are always active. Our interferon genes are only turned on when we have infection, because in other vertebrates, in other mammals, too much interferon can be toxic. And so, but in bats, interferon is not toxic, and they produce amounts of it all the time. Or they can induce interferon very, very rapidly. So as a result of this, you have a persistent infection. They tolerate the virus, or they can get recurrent infections and nothing really happens. However, if you stress animals, we've shown that arousal for hibernation will do this. It'll trigger molecular pathways that suppress this. Or if they get secondary infections, and we've sort of shown that as well, when they have other infections with fungi or bacteria that they're not familiar with, then the viral balance is. If you destroy their habitat and they have to fly long distances, which may be the case for Nipah virus, you disrupt this balance, and bats produce more virus. If you diminish their food supply, same thing happens, and reproduction, the stress of reproduction might do this as well. So when this happens, you suppress these, or you upset this balance, and as a result of that, you have increased viral application, and then you have increased chances of spillover to new hosts. And so this is so far, as I said in my disclaimer, This is very much a work in progress. We're working towards seeing whether this model is actually true or not. And if it is, then it does several things. First of all, it gives us clues as to how we may be able to control or lessen the effects of viral diseases in people. And at the same time, it tells us what sort of things we have to do to prevent a disruption of this balanced relationship. So with that, thanks for being kind enough to listen to me, and I'd be delighted to answer any questions or any part of the discussion. So thanks.
Yeah,
Thank you, sir.
Dr.
It is really wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Any question? I would request to take a respite. Sudhanshu, can you please? We had made a couple of slides, 2-3 slides only for the common people's their interest. Sudhanshu, can you please show them? We wanted to show that cave bat, the bat.
Okay, thanks.
In the PPT. Are we doing it, or should I postpone for some other? Sudhanshu?
I think he's having some technical issues.
Yes.
Great lecture, Dr. Mishra. Great lecture. I learned a lot. And I'm sure that the questions that you have addressed in your talk, I'm sorry, I think Sudhanshu is just coming up. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please put it on display mode, right? So that, the larger space, it should come in. Yeah, Sitao, Kunal. So that is the bat cave.
Yes.
Where this lady, forgetting her name, I noted it.
Daniel Anderson?
No. This is the
No,
Chinese virologist.
Li Zheng.
Li Zheng, exactly, right, sir, right. Li Zheng, exactly. She discovered this cave in 2015. Yeah, next slide, Sudhanshu. And this, I think they are the team members of the WHO's team who also went there. I do not know what did they do. Just two now, or we have more? Yes, just two. A map also. Do you have map? Yunan's map, where it is exactly located? Okay, fine.
So I was.
Yes, sir.
You carry on, Mr. You carry on, or you want me to carry on?
Now, please take it over, Professor.
I was just saying that it was a real great lecture, and there are many issues that you have addressed which are lurking in my mind in the last 1.5 years, because I'm a heart surgeon. I don't deal with viruses or anything like that. But anyway, there are certain questions which actually you provoked me to ask you. And one of them is that it was the slide which showed that bats do have a strong interferon response, TNF factor alpha. Why is it that these viruses don't die in them and lurk somewhere? What mechanism is that helps them to escape their death in the bats itself, if that is the kind of thing that, if I understand correctly, forgive my innocence about this thing.
This is it's a great question, and the short answer is we don't know. I'll tell you what we think, and we have some evidence for this, and that is that what you're looking at in bats is not just the bat's response to the virus, but millions of years of evolution between bats and their viruses. So while the bats have developed fairly strong antiviral responses, fairly rapidly deployed antiviral responses, their viruses have also sort of evolved so that they're not completely eliminated as a result of the interferon response. So if you treat bat cells with interferon, the viruses are still there. The cells still produce interferon. But what it does is that it prevents the virus from replicating really rapidly. Now, if you stress these bats, and we're talking about a coronavirus in these bats, which infects their lungs, but more commonly infects their intestines. And that's how it's sort of passed on, because they secrete the virus in their feces. But if you test the feces of these bats, you find that very, very little virus. In fact, the only way you can find it is if you look at it postmortem and you look at it by using PCR in their intestines. Now, if you stress these bats, what happens is that their innate responses, their innate response pathways in their intestines are immediately suppressed. And as a result of that, any kind of limit that the bat has on virus replication goes away, and the viruses now start replicating in a much more in a much more rapid way, and now the bat starts secreting much more virus. Now, why bats are not completely destroyed by an interferon response, and that is because the interferon response in other species, especially in viruses that are not adapted to that species, is able to sort of, if it's strong enough and if it comes in association with other things, can control viral infection. But for some reason, if you've got a perfectly balanced relationship between bats and viruses, that doesn't happen. And I wish I could give you a much more direct answer as to what exactly the mechanisms are that prevent virus elimination completely from interferon. I really don't know the answer.
Well, we look forward that humans also evolve retrogradely, I guess, in several thousands of years or millions of years, where they will have the same kind of response. I think that is retrogression. And what has been described, I'll take you slightly towards the spiritual side of it. That what they say is that if you don't deal with nature properly, the nature strikes back.
Exactly. And this is one way in which nature strikes back. But you know, if you look at it, you're absolutely right. Over a period of time, pathogens or parasites and their hosts reach a balance, because if the parasite or pathogen killed its host every time before the host was able to transmit the pathogen to another individual, then pathogen would just die out. So over a period of time, especially for pathogens that rely on their hosts being alive and reasonably healthy, you reach a balance. And if you look at most human viral diseases, most of them are zoonotic. They originally came from animals, and so we haven't had an opportunity, or we haven't had the evolutionary time to try to evolve into a benign relationship with them.
This might be some information for you that in the last 30 years, the industry has stopped making new antibiotics. And for the next 30 years, we do not have any antibiotics which we can look forward to treat infections in the humans. And bacteria, they are rapidly developing the resistance to the existing antibiotics. And if you look at another aspect of it, that the pharma industry has now turned completely towards the back toward for the antibiotics, and now they are into investing heavily into vaccines. Do you think there is some relationship between the viral infections that we are seeing in the last probably 20 years or so? There was, I think in 2002, there was what is that summit that they do in some very snow-clad mountains of uh, Switzerland. There is a where all the big corporates and the big people they go, and there they develop alliance, Gavin alliance, and then um, our founder chairman of Microsoft, Mr. Bill Gates, he heavily invested in the 2008 a lot of money into production of um, vaccines. Do you see any relationship of this kind, that the pharma industry stopped taking antibiotics and investing into vaccines suddenly in the last 20 years?
I think you're talking about a very complex thing, and just right off the bat, I personally don't believe there is a relationship between antibiotic resistance, the inability to find new antibiotics that are very effective, and the investment in vaccines. The investment in vaccines is because we are presented globally with some very nasty diseases, and vaccinology has taught us, history has taught us in the last 100 years or so, that vaccination is probably the most effective way of controlling viral infections. And some bacterial infections as well. Now, where the problem with antibiotics is quite different, and that is that antibiotics are largely, most of them, are either derived from or produced by other organisms as a way of competing against other organisms, or they're based or chemically on these molecules. And there are only a limited number of ways in which you can selectively kill bacteria and not harm the host. And so, with the massive use of antibiotics, we've got a problem with antibiotic resistance, and we've run out of ways of coming up with run out of ways we can interfere with bacterial metabolic pathways. So that's really the problem. And now there are encouraging results and techniques to sort of either prevent antibiotic resistance or develop or exploit new pathways to develop new antibiotics. But personally, I don't really see a connection between our failure to control bacterial infections and the investment by companies in vaccines. I think we need the vaccines. Statistics are showing us that what's really controlling COVID-19, certainly our data from Canada and other countries shows that vaccination is what's driving our recovery. So I don't see the connection there. Sorry.
No, thank you very much. This opens a new question in my mind. Is that
Sure.
I agree with you totally that we have run out of ways in developing antibiotics. That should not deter the industry to develop antibiotics, because it takes about 40 years for the final phase of the antibiotics to be released into humans. But that doesn't happen with the vaccines. Vaccines can be prepared very rapidly in large number of doses in a very short
Yes.
period of time. But at
Yes.
the same
Yeah.
time, the flip side of this is that because the viruses, they also mutate very rapidly. So by
Yes.
the time you come out with a vaccine to deal with the situation that you had 6 months ago, you don't have the same situation by the time the vaccines come out for the humans use. So how do you deal really with this? Because now I see that there have been 50 random cases of Delta Plus in India.
Yes.
And obviously, I think only one person has died so far in Rajasthan, but most of them have recovered. But at the same time, that we do not know whether it is because of the vaccine, because none of them were vaccinated. The only person who has died actually had a vaccination, but he has died. And all these people, those who have come out of the COVID infection with Delta plus infection, were not vaccinated. So I really do not know. I think there is some jumble bumble in this because it is not really predictable what is going on.
Again, I'm telling you about my personal beliefs and what I think after having read the literature. I think when you look at vaccines, you have to look at it from a global perspective, rather than individual success or failure. Because the purpose of vaccines is to prevent serious disease, not necessarily infection, because most vaccines don't prevent infection, um, to prevent serious disease in a population. And I think that way the vaccines are incredibly successful. Uh, at the same time, you're always going to have isolated incidents or a certain number of people who either don't respond with enough of a protective response, or respond with a protective response and then and are still, for whatever reason, are susceptible to it. At the same time, you may have people, and this speaks to individual variation between people. You can take 1,000 people that are infected with the same virus, and you can find that they respond very, very differently. Some people have an asymptomatic infection, as we've seen with
Yes.
the SARS-2 virus, and at the other side, at the other end of the spectrum, you have fatal disease, right? And again, this is something we don't really understand on why different people respond in very different ways. There are people who get the Delta variant and get very serious disease. There are people who are vaccinated and can still get serious disease. But if you look at it globally, most vaccinated people, fully vaccinated people, are protected from most of the variants. Oh, protected against serious disease by the vaccination. And here we're seeing in Canada, most of the new cases we are seeing now are in unvaccinated people, or people who have received only one dose of the vaccine. But even in the people who've received one dose, the disease is quite a bit less serious than it is in unvaccinated people.
Leaving aside the Delta plus that you have explained,
Sure.
yesterday there was a report that in Peru they have now discovered another variant of coronavirus, that is lambda.
No.
So I think the virus is mutating in different parts of the world continuously, and
Sure.
I do not know. I'm sure nobody knows that how it is going to affect the global population as such with the vaccines that we have at our hands. Probably when it continues to mutate into some other variant, we have to develop another vaccine in the months to come. Is that true?
So, yeah, well, you've got to look at viruses from an evolutionary point of view, selection of the fittest. Okay, and viruses are really clever, if I can
Very
use that
clever.
word, in that they replicate very rapidly. Each infected cell produces thousands of baby viruses, if you will, and the replication of viruses is prone to making mistakes. So there's a built-in mechanism that generates lots of mutants whenever a virus replicates. What happens though is most of those mutants are not successful because they don't have anything that allows them a better fitness in that animal. So if you have one mutant that can get by the immune system, or if you have one mutant that can replicate more effectively, then that mutant has an advantage, and that's why you see these variants that come up. Now, as far as controlling them is concerned, there are different strategies. For instance, variants that are not controlled by antibodies can still be controlled by the cell-mediated immune response,
Yes.
which relies on a completely different set of proteins. Um, and now, especially with influenza, there are now vaccines that are in phase 3 trials that rely not on producing antibodies by stimulating cell-mediated immune response. And the problem with influenza is that you've got new variants almost every year that can't be neutralized by the antibodies produced by the previous vaccination. But if you can stimulate a cell-mediated response against proteins that are common to all influenza viruses, that might work better. And there's some remarkably promising results from that. The other way of increase or improvement in the technology is that if you can sort of develop a system that can keep up with the variants, such as the RNA vaccines. RNA vaccines are synthetic, and so you can make the changes in the vaccines very, very rapidly. And the same thing happens with recombinant-produced proteins that are used in some of the vaccines. You can make those changes as the variants come up, and so the technology is certainly there to keep up with variants. The problem is that the regulatory machinery is designed to be protective, or as protective as it can be. And so it takes a long time for vaccines to go through these trials to convince the people who approve them that they're indeed safe and effective. And so that's the thing that slows things down.
Thank you so much for addressing my queries. I think Dr. Ganeshwar Chaudhary must be having few questions which relates really
Sure.
genetics and viruses as such. Over to you, Ganeshwar.
Thank you, sir. Brilliant. Some of the questions were really fantastic, and the answers are even more fantastic than the questions, because he has covered the area even from left and right, both sides. So many things have been already answered. But there are a few things, sir, I wanted to know, because
Sure.
like humans are also evolving in the same way. Not same way, but not that faster as the viruses
No.
or any other pathogens. But there would have been encounter of the human ancestors or whatever with such kind of viruses. Previously, let's say 50,000 years, or even the archaic humans 100,000 years back. So these things are not helping humans, or these things are not modulating the human response against the viruses.
I think human evolution, as it relates to resistance to viral innate resistance to viral infection, takes a long time. Okay, to give you an example, human populations separated about certainly into the American American continents about perhaps 30,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago. The dates there's some debate about
Right.
that. But during that time, populations in Asia and Europe separated in a lot of ways from the North American populations. And so when Europeans finally got to North America, they brought with them diseases such as measles and smallpox, which the indigenous population were completely susceptible to. And so you have a huge die-off. So that just tells you that it took about 30,000 years for Asian and European populations to achieve at least a certain amount of innate immunity against these viruses. And so it's a slow process.
Right. Yeah. So, and there is one more question from me that
Sure.
do you think that the Neanderthals, who just were quite successful 40,000 years back, the Neanderthal species of human, I'm talking about them, Neanderthal. So,
Yeah, Neanderthal, yes.
Yeah. So, was there any chance that these kind of viruses were there during the time of modern human and Neanderthal, let's say 40,000 years back, and human could have survived because they had some certain types of genes, and Neanderthal just wiped out because of such kind of catastrophic event?
You know, that again is a really interesting question for which I don't have an answer. Although there are now people exploring the possibility that some of our Neanderthal genes and some of us, I think I have 5% of my DNA is Neanderthal according to National Geographic. There's some research going on now that tries to link susceptibility to SARS-2 or the COVID-19 causing virus to the presence of certain genes that we may have acquired from Neanderthals, because not everybody has the same percentage. As a geneticist, you are, I'm sure, well aware of that. And again, we as humans, we also share, or some humans share Densovanian DNA as well. So how that contributes to our resistance to or susceptibility to viral infections is really an open question, but it's an interesting question. As far as whether these viruses existed when different hominids existed around the world, I would love to find out. I unfortunately haven't seen any of that information as yet. Because it'd be wonderful to see how the viruses have, whatever viruses were there at that time, have changed as hominids have evolved.
Yeah, because we see, sir, or if you look the geography of the humans, then the effect of this SARS-CoV-2, if we talk about this virus, then it is more towards the ancestry, which is more related with European, and the ancestry, which is more related with East Asian or Southeast Asian or Chinese. They are less affected with this virus. So
Okay.
is there any possibility? That's what I'm thinking, that
Yeah.
there could have been more encounters of the Chinese related ancestry even in earlier times. So because of this, they have developed some kind of genes or some kind of positive selection, which is helping these population to overcome this kind of infection.
Yeah, the thing, Yaneshwar, is that thing. It's still early days. We don't have all the data about COVID-19. There are lots of hypotheses about populations being less susceptible or more susceptible, but at this point in time, perhaps we'll have an answer in a couple of years. But I'll give you an example, another example, from a virus that we know a lot more about, and that's HIV. Okay. And there are human populations that are relatively less susceptible to HIV. Northern European populations, for instance, are relatively, if they're homozygous for a CCR5 mutation, are less susceptible to HIV, right? And people have been trying to come up with hypotheses as to why that is. Why does the resistance to HIV is high in Northern Europe and then slowly decreases as you go south? But again, we don't really know the answer. But you're right. This sort of points to human evolution that does influence susceptibility and resistance to viruses. The thing right now is we don't know how it does that, and we certainly don't know how it does that for the COVID-19 causing virus.
Right. And sir, as far as we understand that this virus, when it goes to the cell, it somehow hijacks the mitochondria. So the similar thing could have also happened with the bats. And
Yeah.
right. Yeah. So, but still, bats are able to overcome this just because the time of the evolution of bats and time of the host pathogen interaction for the bats is much longer than humans, or there is some other mechanism which is contrasting this variation.
Yaneshwar, you're asking me some really interesting questions, and I wish I knew the answers to that. This is, but you know, and these are questions we're trying to answer as to, and you're absolutely right. It is entirely possible that bats have evolved all sorts of mechanisms, including resilience in their mitochondria. That allows the cells to survive and still produce enough energy in the cell while they're infected. But I wish I knew the answer.
Actually, we are the newcomers, and we usually learn from people like you, and you are the one who are the torch bearers. So usually, if you give some clues, we just try to work in that area.
You're too kind.
Okay, I don't have any further question, but maybe I can write you emails. That would
absolutely.
be
I'd be delighted to hear from you.
Yeah, that would be
So
fantastic.
I would would have some simple questions from the audience
Sure.
side, from our team side. Pretty simple one from the cure perspective, right? So what I
Sure.
understood from the entire discussion, the bats have gone the higher level of interferon response. So does that mean if humans also somehow increase this interferon level of response, they can neutralize the virus in the early stage? And if this conjecture or maybe the fact is true, so how we can have that? How we can achieve this?
Well, it may not be that simple, Lilith, because interferon in humans and Dr. Gupta will probably tell you more about this than I can. But interferon in humans is in large amounts, and if it persists, is toxic. And that's one of the problems with side effects in interferon therapy for any number of things, in viral infections as well as neoplasias. If you have too much interferon, you really don't feel well because it's a cytokine that triggers all sorts of nasty things. So just the presence of interferon may not be all that beneficial. I think you've got to sort of balance it with trying to figure out what levels are not toxic. Bats seem to have gotten over that because there are bat species that constitute high levels of interferon all the time, and they do just fine because they don't sort of respond quite the same way as we do. So it may not simply be a matter of administering interferon early, although it might help. I don't know. I don't know if anybody's really done enough double-blind studies on using interferon as a therapeutic for COVID-19. I don't know enough about that. However, what might help though isn't so much what bats might be able to tell us is how we might be able to suppress an overabundance of the inflammatory response or an unbalanced inflammatory response. If we know how bats control it, then perhaps we can come up with mechanisms where we can sort of either suppress those inflammatory pathways sufficiently so that they don't run away and cause all the negative effects.
I would request Dr. Gupta to please simplify it more.
No, I think it is a great answer to a very simple question indeed. The key word is balance. The key
Yes.
word of response
Thank
was
you.
balance. So there is a great relationship between balancing the interferon response and the activation of complement in the body. When I put a patient on bypass, every patient has got this response, complement activation, for the number of hours that he's been on artificial circulation on heart-lung machine. So we see all the patients, they feel sick after surgery. They are really sick, and that is why we spend a number of hours in the ICU. All the surgeons in the world will go home after doing surgery, and the only person who stays in the hospital, in the ICU, taking care is because of this response in the ICU for the patient after the surgery. So that makes things simple for you, that this balance between the complement activation and the interferon response of the human body makes all the difference, which is totally different in bats. I think humans are now trying to understand what makes this balance. And once we know what makes this balance, so which is probably very critical and somewhere there in the genes or somewhere there in the genetic code, that trigger point in the humans we know, and if we know what balance is in the bats, then we'll come up with the answer. But I think millions of years of evolution is probably the cover, the blanket that is over this kind of research, I think. But
Thank you so much for helping me out there.
I think in the years to come, the way we are destroying our nature, these viruses will continue to have their way into the humans. And I hope one day the treatment will be like in the second wave of pandemic. The treatment was not antiviral drugs, or we didn't have vaccines at that time anyway. the treatment was just suppressing the inflammatory response in the humans by the steroids. So
That's right.
one day perhaps Dr. Misra will tell us that here is the code which we can activate in humans. Thank you.
Okay. One more question which I am asking every expert rather. So I would repeat the question. I earlier we asked Professor Gupta also. The question is, Dr. Mishra said that virus is becoming very clever. So I am always curious to know if they have got something like mind, can a virus think about its survival or the existence or what? How it decides to make change in its code, genetic code?
So the virus doesn't have a brain. So when I use the word clever, I use it metaphorically rather than anything else. But what governs all of this is basic evolutionary principles of survival of the fittest. And what the viruses have evolved to do is to multiply very quickly and make lots of mistakes. So they can produce 1,000 particles, and 999 of them might be duds, may not even replicate. But if one of those 1,000 particles has just a little bit of an advantage, then that succeeds. It's better off than its brothers and sisters. So it's just basic evolutionary principles.
Okay. So this replication is there. What is triggering the intent to replicate? If it's a biochemical reaction, just reaction is happening, or the virus has got some kind of consciousness that we do have.
It has no consciousness, certainly as far as I know. It's just that it is programmed to reproduce, just as we are. We are programmed to reproduce. The reason why the human species is so successful is that we're successful at reproducing or reaching an age at which we can reproduce. And so, just like that, every living thing is programmed to reproduce itself, and so are viruses. It's just that if they're better at it, they have an advantage.
Okay, I think I understood
I
the
know, I
question.
know where Lalitji is coming from when he said the consciousness.
Okay,
Well,
well, you'll have to enlighten me then, because
Okay.
whatever little I know is the Brahma Sutra and the Vedas. They pronounce that everything that is existing in the universe has consciousness. The simple difference between the consciousness of humans and the consciousness of anything which is we think is non-living is shrouded by avidya. So once even the humans have got this coverage of avidya, what we call is in the Brahma Sutra is explained by Shankara, Adi Shankara. Once this veil of and the shroud of avidya is turned off or taken away, then we realize our potential. And the same thing, perhaps the viruses must be having, obviously, the consciousness. Otherwise, there is no reason for a virus which is not non-living and yet behave like a living once it enters the cell. So the shroud goes off and the virus becomes conscious and it starts multiplying. It also starts to create its brothers and sisters. May not be as good as we are as humans. For example, 9,999 are dead, but one is intelligent. Whereas when the humans reproduce, there is a chance of 9,999 to be and one dead. So that is the difference, I think.
Okay.
well,
Yes.
well, you'll have to forgive my ignorance because I am an ignorant person. But is it possible that the reference to consciousness is used in a very broad term? It is not necessarily neurons in the brain firing or thoughts or intentions. It may just be used as a way. It may be defined as a way of I don't know. Everything tries to survive. or improve itself. And maybe that's how the consciousness is defined,
Yeah,
rather than a simple human way of looking at things.
I think
I don't know. I'm ignorant about these things. So
there is a share by Mir Taki Mir, which
okay,
actually I'm not exactly remembering the words, but I can translate that for you. That after a long while I came to know that I do not know anything. Alas, it is now that I know having wasted all my life. So,
so true.
about your consciousness, I think the difference between your explanation and my explanation stems out of one thing, that your probably explanation of knowing the word consciousness is the Western way. You think that
Could
consciousness
be.
is there in our brains. No, brain does not have any consciousness. It is beyond brain. That is the Vedic consciousness. And my
Okay.
consciousness, your consciousness, Lilith's consciousness, and that SARS-CoV-2 virus's consciousness is just a tiny part of the huge global consciousness or universal consciousness that we are talking. So when you think of consciousness, you think as the brain's consciousness, which anesthetist can take away. But that consciousness,
Sure.
Western explanation of consciousness.
So here I would like to,
I stand corrected. What can I say?
Yes, yes.
okay, I would like to add something that Professor Gupta has said, and Dr. Mishra has also said. That is, recent years, in recent couple of years, the physicists, those who do the study of universe in a mathematical model, they have come up with the idea of mathematics of the consciousness. What they think and propose is the universe itself is conscious about itself. I do not know what I wish that if I could have one physicist today with us, I could have asked how with the application of mathematical modeling you reach this conclusion or you are able to propose that we do not know. But from the on the consciousness perspective, what we think is, I always move around the certain coincidences. What I started thinking is we have got humans, we as a human we have got some receptors in our modern terminology. So this receptor receives certain ideas which cascade down from nowhere. I do not know where. So like in our first interaction with Dr. Mishra, he happened to tell about the One Health.
Yeah.
So actually, I did not want to answer that in the first interaction because 11th May, I encountered a once write-up something about One Health and it appealed to me. So we decided that we would go with this One Health concept. We'll take up the initiative and promote because it also aligns with our way of thinking. So we
Sure.
had this welcome response to this idea. Now when you said, so it was a coincidence because 11th May and the June is not a very big difference. So how come from two people living in a different geographies, thinking and then coming together? I was thinking overnight that day, the day before yesterday.
Yeah.
So what is driving people together? So if it is a part of some design, if that is the consciousness, the larger self of us, this is what I keep thinking when I do not have anything to think.
You have one more thing. You have one more thing to think.
Yes.
That Dr. Mishra was born in Lucknow. I am from Lucknow.
Yes.
From there, Rajasthan, and my father was also from Rajasthan. So what has happened?
So Nirmalji, hopefully we'll meet in Lucknow someday. Does Hazratganj still have a
Yes,
great chaat
yes.
shop?
The
I
prime
remember
place of
there was a Chaudhry's chaat shop in
still there,
Hazratganj. Is it still there?
still there.
So a few more people. I see Vaishali ji, Dr. Anjali was also there. I think he just the connection was not stable, probably. So Vaishali ji, do you have something to ask? Because we are running out of time now. Normally, our discussion, whatever we do, it goes beyond 1 hour. I always
I've got to
plan,
get to bed soon.
yeah, plan for 45 minutes,
Yeah,
and every time we, exceed it. So Vaishali ji, do you have some question? Aman and Sudhanshu also, please ask, or then we'll close this session now. With a great thank to Dr. Mishra, and we would also request to please connect. So my dream was here in India, we should have the conferences in which Nobel Prize winners, those Nobel laureates should come in India and loving to do the lecture so that in the total temperament of the country, it starts picking up towards science from the myth. I want to shift from mythology. Mythologies are important because just my mind, there is a mythical story in our Durga Saptati. There's a demon called Rakta Beach. So wherever every drop of blood was creating a new variety of the demon, new demon. So this is how millions of demons were created, and then this
Viruses.
exactly. So this Kali started, the goddess who killed all the demons, started collecting drop of blood on the khapar, potsherd. उसमें she started collecting, and then this is how this demon was eliminated. So mythologies are helping definitely, but I at Indology Foundation, from my team, we all want to shift from the mythological foundation to the foundation of science, because I all every time I remind our people the first definition of scientific approach, how to apply science, scientific methods to find out truth. This particular thing was first time given by the our Vedic Rishi Vasistha, who in seventh mandala of Rig Veda gives this definition of scientific application of scientific method in terms of suvigyanam chiketishu sacha sach paspridhate. We apply science when truth and falsity, they compete with one another, and then we filter tayor, by that we filter out truth from the untruth. This is what Vasistha said, and this is where that is the first instance where we find the reference to the Vigyan, not Vigyan but Suvigyan, the refined science. So this is there. That was our legacy, and I want India to move in what we have forgotten. But that is also thanks for coming, and also the request to keep connecting us to more Indians, those who are leading the world,
Sure.
maybe out of India, not in India.
Well, well, thank you very much, Lalitji, all of you. It was wonderful to meet you, and a real pleasure.
Whenever
Thanks so
you
much.
come to India, visit Lucknow, and I'll be there to see.
Absolutely. We'll go for chat in Hazrat Ganj.
Yes.
Okay. All right, goodbye.
Lovely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you, sir.
Vaishali ji, you are asking something, or should we close?